The Ethiopian Bible preserves a story about Eve that most of the world has never been told. It is not the story of her beginning, but of her final days, a chapter that was quietly erased from the familiar pages of Genesis. In the standard biblical record, Eve gives birth and then disappears. No age, no grave, no final words. But silence in ancient history is rarely accidental. According to Ethiopian tradition, Eve did not fade quietly into death. Her passing unfolded over 6 days, each one carrying a weight that would shape how humanity remembers loss, hope, and restoration. Stay until the end, because this is not just a forgotten ending. It may be the missing key to understanding why the human story still feels unfinished. After Adam's death, Eve was left alone in a world that had lost its first king. For 6 days, she remained between two realms, carrying memories no one else alive could still hold. Memories of the garden, of light, of what the world once was before exile hardened into habit. What happened during those days was not recorded to comfort us. It was preserved to warn us. Eve did not mourn her own death. She mourned the future her children would inherit, a world where Eden would survive only as a rumor. And yet, in her final hours, she did something no one expected. She spoke, she remembered, and she passed on a promise that refused to die with her. If this story resonates, write one word in the comments: memory. And if you're searching for the forgotten chapters of human history, like, subscribe, and join the tribe. The story does not begin with what was written. It begins with what was left out. In the final chapters of Genesis, Adam is given an ending. His years are counted. His death is named. His burial is remembered. But Eve, the mother of all living, simply vanishes from the record. No age, no grave, no final breath. The text moves on as if her story had already served its purpose. That silence feels small on the page, but heavy in meaning. Because in ancient tradition, silence was never neutral. What was not written was often what could not be controlled, and what could not be controlled was quietly removed. Eve was not a minor character. She was not a footnote. She was the only human who remembered the garden not as a promise, but as a place. She had walked its rivers. She had breathed its air. She had known the world before survival became the law of life. So we must ask the question that history avoids. Why would the memory of her ending be erased? After Adam's death, the world entered an unfamiliar state. For the first time, creation continued without its first man. And Eve remained, not as a ruler, not as a judge, but as a witness. For 6 days, she lived in a world where the one made from her was gone, and nothing could restore that original unity. Those 6 days were not recorded in the standard canon, but in ancient traditions preserved far from imperial centers of power, they were remembered with care. Not because they were dramatic, but because they were dangerous. A woman alone with memory is never harmless to systems built on forgetting. During those days, Eve did not travel. She did not teach publicly. She did not attempt to lead. She sat at the threshold of what had been lost, refusing food, refusing comfort, refusing distraction. The world around her continued. Her children worked the land. The rhythms of survival pressed forward. But Eve did not move with them. She stayed with the memory. And memory, when left unspoken, begins to decay. When unprotected, it turns into myth, and when myth becomes inconvenient, it is dismissed as imagination. That is why these 6 days mattered. They formed a mirror to creation itself. Where the world had once been built in stages, Eve now began to loosen her attachment to it in stages. Not because she despised the earth, but because she understood something her descendants would forget. This world was never meant to feel complete without the garden. Eve became the widow of the earth. Not a widow in grief alone, but a widow in responsibility. She was the last living bridge between what humanity was and what it had become. And bridges are not meant to be permanent. They exist to carry something across before they are left behind. The silence surrounding Eve's death was not born from ignorance, it was born from fear. Because if Eve's final days were remembered, then humanity would be forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. The fall was not the end of memory, and exile did not erase hope. But that hope did not belong to kings or priests, it belonged to a mother. And before her voice could be dismissed, it would need to be silenced. What happened next was not recorded in the familiar texts, but it was preserved where memory was still treated as sacred. And in the days that followed, Eve would speak in a way that would shape human longing for generations. But before she spoke, she remembered. And memory, once spoken aloud, can never be buried again. When Adam died, the world did not stop. The sun still rose. The ground still demanded labor. The children still needed to eat. But something essential was missing. Something no rhythm of survival could replace. For the first time since creation, the earth existed without its first man. And Eve remained. She did not follow Adam into death immediately. She stayed behind for 6 full days, not by accident, not by weakness, but because the pattern of creation itself was being reversed. The world had been formed in 6 days. Now, for 6 days, Eve began to loosen her hold on it. These days were not empty, they were heavy. Each one carried a different weight of separation. Eve was no longer a wife, yet not fully a widow. No longer a citizen of Eden, yet not entirely at home in exile. She existed between states, suspended in a quiet that felt deeper than grief. She sat at the entrance of the cave where Adam's body rested. The place was not only a tomb, it was a threshold, a boundary between breath and dust, between memory and silence. The texts say she refused food and water, not as an act of self-punishment, but as an act of attention. She would not dull her senses while the world itself was changing. During those 6 days, Eve became something no other human had been before her. She was the sole living witness to a world without its origin. Everyone else was born into exile. Eve had lived before it. That difference mattered. Her children still worked the land. They learned how to survive east of the garden. But Eve was not learning survival. She was learning release. Each day another thread binding her to the world was gently cut. Not violently, not in despair, but with awareness. This was not mourning in the way later generations would understand it. This was preparation. The ancient traditions describe these days as a passage, a slow crossing rather than a sudden fall. Eve was not waiting for death to take her. She was walking toward it, step by step, carrying with her the full weight of what humanity had lost and what it still hoped for. She did not speak much during this time. Words would come later. First came memory. Memory of the garden, not as myth, but as lived reality. Memory of a world where life was sustained by presence, not by effort. And memory is dangerous when it stands alone. A world that moves forward prefers to forget what no longer fits. Eve's stillness was a quiet refusal to accept exile as normal. As long as she remembered Eden clearly, the world could not fully convince itself that this was all there ever had been. That is why these 6 days were necessary. They were not only the closing of a life, they were the final resistance of memory before it would have to be spoken aloud or lost forever. By the end of the 6th day, Eve understood something her children could not yet see. Memory cannot remain private. If it does, it dies with the one who carries it. And Eve was running out of time. What happened next did not come from sorrow, but from clarity, and it would change the way her death was understood forever. Eve did not spend her final days speaking about herself. She did not ask how she would be remembered. She did not ask how long her name would last. Her concern moved in the opposite direction, toward a future she would never see. What broke her silence was not fear of death, but fear of forgetting. The ancient scrolls preserve a lament, spoken quietly, not to the heavens, but to her son. It was not a speech meant to command, it was a memory meant to survive. Eve spoke because memory, once carried alone, becomes a burden too heavy for one soul. She told him not to mistake the thorns of the earth for the world God intended, not to look at exile and assume it was normal. She spoke of rivers that did not demand labor to be beautiful, of gold that lay open beneath clear water, of a tree whose presence felt like breath itself, not forbidden, not distant, but alive. These were not poetic embellishments, they were acts of preservation. Eve understood something her descendants would struggle to accept. Survival changes perception. Over time, what is endured begins to feel inevitable, and what feels inevitable eventually feels right. The danger was not that Eden was lost, the danger was that it would be forgotten. So Eve became the keeper of what no longer existed. Adam had carried the weight of labor, of naming, of endurance. Eve carried something less visible, but no less vital. She carried memory as responsibility. Not nostalgia for comfort, but remembrance as resistance. As long as Eden was remembered clearly, the fallen world could never fully claim the loyalty of the human heart. This is why the traditions speak of her lament as sacred. She was not mourning what she lost, she was protecting what must not be normalized. Her words were meant to lodge themselves inside the blood and bones of her children, not as longing, but as direction, a reminder that the world they knew was not the world as it was first spoken into being. In this moment, Eve became a teacher, not of law, not of survival, but of orientation. She taught her children how to feel uneasy in exile without losing hope, how to work the ground without believing it was home, how to live forward without letting memory collapse behind them. This was why her voice could not be allowed to remain central in later traditions. A woman who remembers too clearly cannot be used as a warning alone. She becomes a compass, and a compass challenges systems that prefer obedience over direction. Eve's lament did not end in despair, it ended in transmission. She passed on the weight of memory deliberately, knowing it would shape how her children interpreted every generation that followed. And once the memory was spoken, something shifted. Eve no longer carried it alone. What came next was not another lament, but a vision, one that would answer the question every exile carries quietly, whether what was lost could ever be restored. On the fourth day after Adam's death, something happened that no living human had ever witnessed before. Eve fell into a deep stillness, not sleep as the body knows it, but a suspension of the senses, as if the world itself stepped back. The ancient texts describe this moment carefully, because what followed was not a dream meant to comfort, but a vision meant to seal understanding. The heavens opened. Eve did not see a grave. She did not see decay. She saw movement. A chariot of light descended, drawn by 4 radiant beings whose wings stretched wider than the sky itself. Their motion was not violent. It was precise, purposeful, as if every part of creation knew exactly what was required. Upon that chariot was the soul of Adam. He was no longer marked by labor or sorrow. The weight of exile had been lifted from him. The vision showed him being escorted by the archangels, carried toward a place the living could not enter by effort or memory alone. Eve watched as Adam was brought to the waters of heaven, where his soul was washed and his garment of light restored. This was not a spectacle. It was a verdict. In that moment, Eve understood something that had been hidden since the fall. Death was not the erasure of the human story. It was the return of what had been broken to its original intention. Adam was not being punished, he was being received. The vision sealed Eve's fear. She realized that the fall had not ended forgiveness, that exile had not canceled restoration. What had been lost in the garden was not gone forever. It was waiting. This knowledge changed the way she faced her own death. Shame could no longer define her. Fear no longer ruled her final hours. The certainty of restoration replaced the anxiety of separation. Eve was no longer simply the widow of the earth. She became the bearer of assurance, the first human to know with certainty that the story did not end in dust. The ancient tradition preserves this vision not to elevate Eve above others, but to explain her composure, why she did not cling to life in panic, why her final words carried clarity rather than regret. She had seen beyond the veil, and because she had seen, she knew what must be done next. Memory alone was not enough. Assurance demanded transmission. The knowledge of restoration could not remain private. If death was not the end, then the future could be faced without despair. The vision did not call Eve upward immediately. It returned her to the earth with a task still unfinished. One final act remained, an act that would echo far beyond her lifetime. Before Eve could leave the world, she would gather those who came from her, and she would speak not from longing, but from certainty. By the fifth day, Eve knew that time had become precise. Her breath still came easily, but her awareness had sharpened. The certainty given to her in the vision had removed confusion, not urgency. She did not rush, she prepared, and preparation in the ancient world was an act of meaning. Eve called her children and their descendants together, not with command, but with gravity. From the valleys and the highlands, the line of Seth gathered. They came without banners or weapons. They came in silence, sensing that something older than authority was about to speak. This was the first convocation in human history. Eve stood before them not as a ruler and not as a prophet crowned by power. She stood as a mother nearing her final hour. She did not distribute land. She did not name successors. She gave no instructions for survival. Instead, she gave them something far more dangerous. She gave them hope with a memory attached. She told them that the world would not always remain as it was, that a day would come when the earth would be washed with water, and another day would come when it would be tested with fire. But through every trial, the seed she carried would survive. Her words did not describe timelines, they described direction. From her body, she said, would come one who would walk back into the garden, not alone, but carrying humanity with him. The exile would not be permanent. The path home had not been erased. It had only been delayed. This was not theology formed in halls of power. It was promise spoken at the edge of death. A proto-gospel delivered not by a king or priest, but by the first mother of the human line. What made her words powerful was not certainty of detail, but certainty of outcome. Eve did not explain how restoration would happen. She explained why it could not fail, because it was tied not to human achievement, but to divine intention. In this moment, Eve did something unprecedented. She reframed suffering. Flood and fire were not curses meant to erase humanity, but passages meant to refine it. History would not move randomly, it would move with purpose, even when that purpose was hidden. The people did not answer her with celebration. They stood in stillness. They understood instinctively that they were receiving something heavier than instruction. They were receiving responsibility. To carry the promise forward meant refusing to collapse into the present. It meant living in a world that often felt final while believing it was not. This was the inheritance Eve left behind. Not certainty of ease, not freedom from loss, but orientation. a way of facing history without surrendering to it. When she finished speaking, Eve did not wait for agreement. She had not spoken to persuade. She had spoken to plant something that would outlive her. The seed had been entrusted. What remained now was not speech, but surrender, and the earth itself was already preparing to receive her. Eve died on the 6th day. Her death did not arrive with violence. It came with recognition. The ancient texts say that when her breath finally left her, the earth beneath her responded, not with destruction, but with awareness, as if the ground itself understood that it was receiving back what had once been taken from it. The body of the first mother was handled with care unlike any before her. Linen from the mountain was wrapped around her. Spices from the holy grove were placed upon her, not to preserve her, but to honor what she had carried. She was brought into the cave of treasures. This was the same place where Adam's body rested, surrounded by the gold, frankincense, and myrrh preserved from Eden itself. Eve was not placed apart. She was not given a separate chamber. She was laid to the right of Adam, where the ancient tradition says she belonged. The two who had been made of one flesh were reunited in the earth. The scrolls call this moment the marriage of the grave, not a return to innocence, but a return to unity. In life, they had carried different burdens. In death, they rested side by side, no longer divided by exile or consequence. And then, something unexpected occurred. As Eve was placed beside Adam, the treasures within the cave released a fragrance so strong it traveled far beyond the mountain. Those nearby said it was as if the scent of the garden itself had been unlocked, not recreated, but remembered by the earth. This fragrance did not fade quickly. It lingered for generations, serving as a quiet sign to the descendants of Seth. The promise spoken by Eve had not expired. It was still active, still waiting. As the story closes, a question remains. Why was this ending not preserved in the dominant traditions of the West? Why does Eve vanish from the record after the fall, stripped of her voice, her vision, and her dignity? Because a woman who sees restoration cannot be reduced to a warning, and a mother who speaks hope cannot be used as a symbol of failure. To silence Eve was to simplify the story, to remove complexity, to make exile feel final. But the traditions preserved in Ethiopia refused that silence. They understood that the story of humanity is incomplete without the transition of its mother, that redemption does not travel through fathers alone, but through memory guarded in the womb of hope. Eve was the widow of the world for 6 days, so that humanity would learn how to endure its long waiting, the time between what was lost and what will be restored. She died with her eyes lifted toward what she had seen, and her heart anchored in what she remembered. And if history has taught us anything, it is this: the greatest truths are often hidden where the record falls silent, and what is forgotten on the page may still shape the destiny of the world.